Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. Today we are rejoined by political theorist, writer, rock and roll terrorist, and heartbreaker Thomas777. Thomas, how are you? How is life as a shark? A lot of times on Twitter, you've always identified yourself as a shark and continue to talk about sharks. So how is life as a shark?
I mean, it's pretty dope because there's a splendid simplicity to it, and really it just involves terrorizing and eating lesser organisms. And the shark actually does not have politics. That's one way in which his life is impoverished, but that can also be quite liberating because the shark also does not need to deal with Marxists, like deranged woke types, assorted other people who claim that taking, prank selfies in the U.S. Capitol is a form of violent sedition. The shark does not have to deal with any of those things. Like, there's a sort of beautiful simplicity to the way in which he deals with his lessers. So I envy the shark as well as trying to emulate him.
Well, that's we all should emulate the shark. And today we're on a very shark-focused topic. As you say, that we're not going to discuss politics because the shark doesn't care about politics. But apparently the shark is a big into heavy metal. So I've been telling listeners we're going to have an episode that's not dealing with current politics for weeks, but we keep getting news. Finally having that episode, and we're going to discuss heavy metal music, of course. Thomas is a longtime metal fan and even shared a picture of himself in elementary school wearing a Judas Priest shirt. I believed it was, I think it might have been Hellbent for Leather or Screaming for
British Steel. Yeah.
British Steel. Yep. So, classic shirt, classic album. So, Thomas, how about you first explain how you got into heavy metal and why you like the genre?
Well, I mean, I became kind of my dad was an economist, but he dealt a lot with public policy. So there was constantly like media on in my house of all sorts. And there's a pop culture dimension to that, especially because the moral majority like focused on these kinds of things. So as a kid, I grew up in Chicago, and Chicago was a huge like musical town, with everything from blues to, the kind of country Western stuff that the Appalachian people who arrived in Uptown brought with them. To rock and roll, and like Eddie Cochran, and both Eddie Cochran and Elvis had like a huge fan base on the ground there. So from an early age, I kind of had like an awareness of these things, but I developed a huge interest in Iron Maiden in earnest, actually, when Tammy Faye Baker singled out Iron Maiden and I think the band Wasp, like, for this crazy rant about how, there was, subliminal messages in these songs. I think specifically the Number of the Beast and in one of the Wasp albums. I can't remember because I'm never a huge Wasp fan, but so this got on my radar when I was literally like 7, 8 years old, like around like 1983, 84. So like I convinced my mom to buy me Iron Maiden Peace of Mind. And it just really it just really kind of like rocked my world, quite literally, and I'm like, wow, this is unlike anything I've heard. And my mom would play stuff like the Rolling Stones and like Three Dog Night, which was dope. But like Maiden was kind of like one step beyond all of that. So I just kind of got turned on to heavy metal through immersion and kind of by like, plus two, as you remember, because I mean I know you're younger than I am because I'm old as hell, but the recording industry used to have huge cachet in pop culture. Not just pre-internet, but before there was. Before cable was really anything other than a couple movie channels, and that's kind of where you went to find out like what was fresh. And I mean that's basically how, just like the optics of things and like the intensity. And also even as a young kid, I mean it wasn't really until I was like 12, 13 I started kind of developing ideas about the culture and things, obviously. But I kind of like as I got older, my interest developed in earnest, because I realized like in a real way, like this is kind of the only high energy, intense kind of edgy thing that's being produced by anybody. Like the rest of the culture is kind of just blasé, or it's stupid, or it's just kind of not really anything that any normal like young guy would want to like identify with. So I kind of it kind of became like a core part of my identity. And that probably sounds weird to kids now who just like spin stuff on cloud and whatever, but it was a big deal then, like the kind of shit that you listen to on cassette or CD. So I mean that's basically the long and short of how I got turned on to metal.
Yeah, I think, there's a couple different points I want to respond to because there's a lot of interesting things. The first thing I want to say is that you do hit on a good point about the difference, generational differences, is that this is still a time in my day. I was born in 1990. You were born in 77, 76?
76, yeah. Getting old.
76. So you're Gen X, I'm millennial.
Yeah.
There was still a time where kids in high school still defined themselves about what their music was, what music they listened to. It was lessening for millennials, but it was still a thing. And even when I was in high school, like my identity was being a metalhead, like wearing metal shirts, collecting
awesome.
metal albums. So it's very similar in the 80s, and it's probably a much bigger deal for Gen X types, and especially with the music industry, is that people would buy the albums. People don't really buy albums anymore.
No.
At least a lot of the Zoomers. I mean, it's like individual songs. I mean, they still have like albums, but it's also a decline of the rock music. Is that rock music is no longer the primary music for young adults anymore. It's rap music, which we'll go into a bit later. But going into your point, or well, into different points, is that you got into metal through like a politician's wife on TV. I think that was Howard Baker's wife, Tammy Faye Baker. Yeah. Because her and Al Gore's wife, or then wife, Tipper Gore, started the PMRC, Parents Music Resource Center or Council. I think it was Center.
Yeah,
I always forget what the C is. And that's how you got into it. For me, I got into it through the internet because like the metal bands I was listening to was definitely not on MTV. Or there would have been no way I would have heard of stuff like Mayhem, Morbid Angel, or Slayer from ordinary sources. So I got it through the internet. And I think it was like researching something on politics. I think it was like even some lefty website that was like documenting like hateful music or something. And like I got introduced into black metal and the black metal story. And I was like, wow, this is insane. I want to look into more of these bands. So I got into it. And I got into it at a much later age. But I always liked high energy music. Wherever I could find it as a kid. But at that time, I would have been listening to like, I don't know, new metal or whatever techno songs were in the Blade movies or something like that. So that's how I got in. But, going to a topic I want to, discuss is the PMRC, which is a lot of the kids who probably listen to the show have no earthly idea what that is. And the PMRC was a huge cultural phenomenon. It was all these senators' wives, as I mentioned, Tammy Faye Baker, wife of Howard Baker, and Al Gore's wife, Tipper Gore. Howard Baker was a Republican. Al Gore, of course, was a Democrat. They got together and they formed this massive group to effectively ban heavy metal. And they had like the Filthy 15 songs, which they had, which some of them were pop songs. I think there was like some Pat Benatar on there, or Cyndi Lauper, I think, and Prince was on there. But most of it was dedicated to heavy metal. And there were bands that were definitely not getting played on the radio, like Venom, Mercyful Fate, which you don't like Mercyful Fate, but we'll get into that in a bit. Sure. Wasp was on there. I think Animal Fuck Like a Beast. I really like Wasp. That and Judas Priest. And so all these bands were on there, and that's how you could have gotten introduced to this. And that time what was it like listening to metal at that time when, you effectively had a very powerful political force trying to ban it?
Well, the whole culture was weird. Like, something I've dropped on younger guys. I mean, I'm not going to go too far afield, but I do have to kind of go on a little tangent just for context. Like, Reagan's first term, and really until about 1987, 88, like, there was something really weird in the culture. Like, people had this really kind of like apocalyptic sense, I mean, owing obviously to the end of Détente and some of the real punctuated like war scares, in 82, 83, and even into 84. So that's when televangelism really kind of jumped off. So people would tune in, to like the Bakers, or they tune into Oral Roberts, and or they tune into Swagger. Swagger would be like, look, like, I know you're scared. You want to know what's happening around you. The reason why we're careening towards Armageddon, it's because, people who are into Satanism or, evil pagan sensibilities, they penetrated the culture. They're insinuating this stuff into popular music. And basically, guys like particularly Baker, but also some of the more mainstream types would, mainstream, in terms of like wider viewership, even like Oral Roberts, you'd say like, look, when your kid's listening to Maiden or Judas Priest, he's being indoctrinated into satanic thought. And people really did believe that. Like, this wasn't just something that like hillbillies believed in, or, holy roller types on the fringe. Like, this was a pretty mainstream idea. So if you were like a 12 or 13-year-old kid in like the late 80s, and somebody saw you in like a Maiden shirt, like you'd get a fair amount of shit for it, So it's like it's kind of twofold. It's like you're listening to this music and you're like, well, I don't, it's not really inspiring those kinds of macabre thoughts to me at all. That seems crazy. Even as like a little kid, I thought this. And secondly, it's like, it kind of like marked you apart. And I mean, I think for a lot of guys, honestly, that was kind of like their ingress into like less conventional politics in terms of what's, considered acceptable. Because it's like, well, they spent their formative years kind of like consuming media that, they were kind of hazed for liking. I mean, I know that sounds goofy as hell now, but this honestly is the way like people thought. I mean, that seems bizarre in when like any kid can, like watch any kind of perverted friggin' like hardcore pornography he wants, and when people have been jaded by some some of the shock annex or dudes like G.G. Allen or like the Mentors. I mean, even even people wouldn't be up on that stuff anymore, like ordinarily, like now are, because of the internet. But I mean, that was really a thing. It was like kind of this kind of like satanic panic was. I mean, there was it was a real thing, and it was inextricably bound up with Cold War anxiety about the fact we might all be dead and like the world as we know it might end in favor of something quite hellish. So, I mean that it was definitely more like subcultural. I mean, there was a lot of guys, and plenty of girls too, honestly, who like real metal, like Priest and like Maiden and like Venom. But I mean, it definitely was like a subcultural tendency. So and like I said, because the only way you could connect with people who like the kind of shit that you liked was to, like actually meet them in real space, whether it was at, the record shop or the arcade or, at like the high school football game or whatever. Like it was just kind of like a different thing, man. Like it felt like quite a bit more tangible, and you were like very conscious of the fact that like most people did not approve of it. And yeah, I mean, that's the best way I can describe it. And
I agree.
Yeah.
Oh
no, I was going to say that probably in the mid 90s that changed as like kind of gangster rap became kind of like the go-to panic thing. Like, oh shit, like my kid's listening to NWA, he's going to become some kind of street guy and like drop bodies. I mean, that's stupid too, but like for other reasons. But it wasn't nearly as pronounced. I mean, but yeah, I'd say by like the mid 90s, if you were a big fan of like Cannibal Corpse or something or Deicide, yeah, people would still give you shit about that, but it was not nearly like as insinuated into the culture, so it wasn't nearly as much of a target. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, even in my time when I was like listening to that, it was definitely a musical decision that you make a very good point that this is like you're listening to an unpopular form of music where pretty much everyone's like, I don't like this. This sucks. Like this guy's screaming at me. Why aren't you listening to something nice? Like I can't understand the lyrics. Like what is on the cover? There's like dismembered bodies. I don't want to watch this. They want like something nice. So you automatically have a reflex to like people reflecting on your politics. Like you can't believe that. That's not what you're supposed to believe. That's racist. I don't like that. And you've already experienced that. Like just listening to metal as like you're listening to a form of music that most of the people don't accept and hate, and like larger society doesn't really necessarily approve of, but you appreciate it anyway, and you have your own, like you have to develop reasons for liking this and like really solidifying your support for this form of music that everyone else hates. So I think that's a pretty good point. And I think there's a lot of people on our side who have metal backgrounds, and maybe that was the impetus for it. And going on some of the points with the PMRC, as you brought up that there was all this satanic panic, and it was, driven a large part by religious fundamentalists like Jimmy Swaggart and the televangelists, and all the heavy metal bands had a song attacking televangelists and several songs warning about nuclear holocaust. They also always, for a lot of the thrash bands in the late 80s, decided to have environmentalist songs as well for some reason. But they all definitely had a song attacking like televangelicals, such as Leper Messiah from Metallica. Slayer had a bunch. And so they all made sure to have these songs. And it wasn't necessarily just, fundamentalist evangelicals who were attacking this. There was also the liberal holdovers from the 1960s, who really just wanted people to like listen to the Beatles or Jefferson Airplane, and that's what kids should listen to. And that was like represented by Al Gore and his wife. And And a lot of their concerns, like, this is misogynistic. It's promoting S&M, which degrades women, and we really don't like these like masculine, overt machismo. This is like something dangerous that's encouraging violence. And one of the famous moments of the PMRC is they had a Senate hearing, I think it was 85 or 86, and Dee Snider of Twisted Sister showed up, and he didn't wear a suit. He wore a cutoff denim vest, and a cutoff T-shirt, jeans, and his like long, like teased hair. And he like pulled out like a speech from his pocket. It was like crumpled up paper, and he gave a whole speech. And the primary purpose of the speech was to appeal to both sides in the 80s culture. He tried to claim that he's a devout family man who doesn't smoke or drink. He may have cited that he's a Christian, even though I think Dee Snider was raised Jewish. But I think he claims he has like a strong faith. Doesn't smoke or drink. Is a father. Is providing, trying to be a superior role model to his kids. Faithful to his wife. And so he's trying to appeal to conservatives with that. And then even with his music, he's like forswearing any misogyny or sexism. He's like, our lyrics are very respectful of women. We don't talk about S&M or any of these topics. And, I respect women and I'm not around groupies. So it's very interesting, climate that he's responding to. Compared to now, when you'd have to, defend yourself. And most of these artists don't have to really defend themselves in this way, where this guy's clearly not looking like a cookie cutter member of the mainstream through his, cut off denim vest and jeans and long hair, is going before and trying to say, like, actually, I am a normal member of society in the Reagan era. I may just look different, but I have the same values as you. And this was his message to that. And I think a lot of the later metal bands, especially from black metal, probably wouldn't have tried to appeal to the mainstream because they would have, felt that there's something fundamentally wrong in mainstream life, that they don't necessarily want to be a part of it. So that's something different. Yeah. So that's something very different from the 80s. And another thing is, you were mentioning that, most of these kids, average white teenager who's like on the football team, turned to gangster rap in the mid 90s. Would you have said that those types that were, the jocks on the football team would in the 80s have listened to Motley Crue and Judas Priest and Wasp back then, rather than
it would have been a mix of guys who were up on stuff like Def Leppard and things like that. And yeah, there'd be like spillover into heavier stuff. But it was interesting because by the end of the 80s, like some iteration of metal, albeit like a very watered down kind, like it become pretty mainstream. But see, like the reasons for that are interesting. Like, it's notable to me that you dropped the Beatles, and like people get mad at me when I say this, but a guy who actually knew rock and roll, like in terms of its history and origins, better than almost anybody, was Wolfman Jack, like the DJ. And he made a lot of people mad in the 70s when he's like, look. He's like, you want to know what killed rock and roll? He's like, the Beatles killed rock and roll. He's like, rock and roll is like dirty, white, redneck Southerners, like kicking out jams that make church ladies upset, make teenage girls swoon, and make the local sheriff agitated that, some kind of juvenile delinquency epidemic is looming. It's not like the Beatles are basically a boy band. It's like I realized they were actually working class guys who had tough upbringings, but like the Beatles, like saying the Beatles is rock and roll is kind of like saying like NSYNC is heavy metal. Like rock and roll is Eddie Cochran, it's Elvis, it's the Big Bopper, it's Richie Valens. Like they were on. If you like the Beatles, you got to stipulate they were like on like a totally different thing. So the reason why heavy metal kind of took off so much is because it's like kids like my age and a little older. It's like you grow up and there's like two things on the radio. It's like this kind of 60s hangover of like peace music and and stuff like Buffalo Springfield. Then it's kind of like this weird, dopey, like easy listening stuff that, like kind of crap you'd hear if you're in like Whole Foods now and the piped in music. So it's like heavy metal, like different as it was from, stuff like Eddie Cochran or Richie Valens or Buddy Holly. It did have like a ballsy, like high intensity and like, dare I say, like very white kind of sensibility about it. And kids are just kind of like, oh, this is dope. Like I want to rep this, like, cause it's cool. And like, it's not cool to like, it's not cool to be into Buffalo Springfield. It's not cool to it's not cool to be into Billy Joel. It's okay. Maybe I know people are going to rebut, be like, oh, Billy Joel's a great songwriter. It's like, yeah, maybe he is, man, but that's not exactly high energy shit that, guys were kind of being ruled by their adolescent intensity and passion are going to go for. So yeah, that's basically there was a culture war dimension to the PMRC that was huge beyond the obvious. I mean, yeah, it was the moralist types, to your point. I mean, you made both points. It was the moralist types, saying like, this is satanic, this is awful, it's leading people, down the left-hand path to ruin. But yeah, then you also have these like boomer liberals who are basically just like, this is garbage, it's bad, it's far too white, its origins are far too southern. The people who like it are far too like urban, white, ethnic, and rural. It's just like music for deplorable people, and that was very much present, particularly in people like, particularly in like the Andrea Dworkin types who were saying like, oh, like Wasp is like rape music, or I think there's some corny as hell album. I think it was by like Warrant or Slaughter. Just they had some like half naked girl, like Playboy type model posed on the cover, and like they went nuts about that. It's like Jesus. It's like if that's that'd be pretty tame, like even by the 50s. It's like if you're like if you're going berserk about that, it's like imagine if they saw some real like conceptual album art from something like the Mentors or like heard like a G.G. Allen record. I mean, I know neither of those acts are metal, but you take the point. So yeah, I mean, it was very much a moral majority kind of coming at what they viewed as the deteriorated morals of their kind of proletarian lessers in their mind. But also, yeah, it was basically boomer lefties like terrified at the emergence of like anything like what rock and roll had been, which really died. With the emergence of the Beatles, and that was very deliberate. Wolfman Jack made that point. He's like, suddenly, like, if you were like Southern rock and roll, like, you just could not get played. It was, oh, we're gonna play the Beatles. There was a contrived element to Beatlemania. It was not just spontaneous. But yeah, go ahead. I didn't mean to.
No, go. You're good rant. But one point I would like to say is that in my generation, people love what their parents were listening to. Because like classic rock, the development of what is classic rock and like the classic rock stations. I think that occurred really in like the late 90s, and a lot of people my age, they were listening to like what their boomer parents listened to. They were like wearing like Pink Floyd shirts and Led Zeppelin, and that was like more popular to like what your parents liked. And I even remember my dad being like, why are you guys like listening to what I listened to? I hated what my parents listened to. And that difference didn't happen. It's like boomers didn't like what their parents, and I think a lot of Gen X people rejected like the boomer music. But for millennials, they love the boomer music, and that's like just carried on. I think mainly it's because rock music hadn't been really I think after grunge, like it wasn't necessarily like new things were as many new popular forms were emerging for them to get into. I mean, you had like indie rock, which was totally a fet, like really lowered your testosterone listening to really low energy, not necessarily high energy music that is masculine, which like classic rock, if you're just wanting to put on music that's a little bit more high energy than country, but still respectable or still acceptable by mainstream society, which metal is not, that is what you would put on. And so that's something I don't know necessarily when classic rock would have been a concept in your age and when you were growing up. I don't know if that was still like a concept of classic rock in the late 80s.
There was kind of, but it's also like in Chicago, like you still had guys who would spin stuff like Thin Lizzy. You still had guys who would spin stuff, like Led Zepp, because there were neighbors, especially white hoods in Chicago, like they got kind of like frozen in time. Like I remember, if you look at pictures of like Steinmetz High School when you still had like a white population there, or like Lane Tech on the north side, like you'll see dudes from like 1979 and they're dressed like straight up greasers. It's like, I mean, Chicago's always been kind of time warped in weird ways. But it's also, yeah, I think that was part of like the white ethnic protest culture too, was when what they viewed as like ethnic music was taking off and like soft hippie music. These guys were like, the younger brothers of non-vets and stuff, and guys who frankly, they didn't like, black people being forcibly moved into their hoods. They're like, fuck you, I'm gonna play Thin Lizzy, I'm gonna play Led Zepp, I'm gonna play the Eagles. And I mean, some of that stuff is dope, some of it is not so dope, but it definitely was different than what was being dropped, like in the 80s, like on the North Shore where I lived. So yeah, it was a thing, but like I said, owing to accident and geography, I think it was more a thing where I was at than some places. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm now imagining white ethnics in these Chicago neighborhoods, like holding up an LP of the Eagles Hotel California, like, you know what this means? It means not welcome. And like the blacks are just fleeing as they're like hearing Hotel California played for like the 10th time. You know, that's maybe they were doing that. I will have to investigate on that. But you know, going to how like this music developed, and you've made a very controversial point about saying you don't like rap music and you encourage people to not listen to it. Why don't you explain that a little bit? Because most of the Zoomers I know, they love rap music. That's like their music to go to. For millennials, it's still divided. A lot of millennials still like rap music because that is like the generic male music for people of our generation, and especially for Zoomers. So what are your thoughts on rap music and how it supplanted rock music?
I got mixed. Well, there's a moment in time when it did, in my opinion, and I'll get to that in a moment. But see, I got mixed feelings about rap generally. I think there's some rap that is pretty dope, like stuff from. I mean, rap at one time was like underground, like street stuff, and then I mean, once it blew up, and once like WGCI and kind of mainstream black radio started playing it, it became like it became very much like a corporate iteration of cultural branding. But stuff like Eazy-E and MC Ren, stuff like Paris, like stuff like KRS-One. I'm not always up on the politics of that stuff, but like some of it I kind of like, and I can see that. But really, what it had going for it was that it was telling like Axl Rose, I believe, was the '89 VMAs, and Axl Rose, like he was an interesting guy, and Guns N' Roses was the only band to come out of the Sunset Strip that had like real freaking cojones, in my opinion, and really kind of shook stuff up. And Axl Rose showed up wearing he performed at VMA wearing an NWA hat, and that's when NWA was raising all kinds of hell. And LAPD was like shutting down their shows because of the shit that they were talking and stuff. And it's like, so you had a bunch of guys who ordinarily wouldn't be up on that kind of stuff. And I go, wow, like, why is Axl like into this shit? Like, maybe I should listen to it. And the reason why he was up on that is because he was looking for some, and he even admitted this later in his own way, he was looking for some kind of edgy music that was contemporary. They didn't have to, dig into the archives of 20 years back, to make a statement. And yeah, I think that's, and even, and as what kind of remained of metal like died, because it had been sort of, I mean, in the mainstream, underground metal was doing just fine then, but as mainstream metal bands became more and more watered down, more and more cookie cutter, people became more and more kind of tired and unenthusiastic about shelling out money to listen to that shit. Like real gangster rap filled the void, and those dudes, like, and again, I'm not gonna jump on another tangent, but those early gangster rap cats, like, they were like the early black metal guys. They meant what they were saying. Those guys did drop bodies. Those guys did sling dope. Like, they weren't dudes like Drake, it was like some like nerdy Jewish guy who lives at his mom's house, like trying to act like he's fucking bitches and like slapping people up. Like, it wasn't phony. Like, it was real. Like, Eazy-E like funded his a lot of NWA was funded by the fact that Eazy-E was like a fucking very successful crack dealer. Like MC Ren, like, really was like, I mean, I don't know what set he was with, but he was a hardcore gangbanger. I mean, like, that was common in those days, and so it's like, I dig it. I understand why guys like were up on that. I mean, my issue with it is when, like, I think it's an alienating tendency, particularly when like white kids just get up on that, and it kind of becomes their default like participation in like popular culture. And that's kind of why I encourage like younger guys. It's like, look, if you want to spend rap, I'm not gonna tell you like what you like, but at least be discriminating. Don't listen to like bullshit like Drake. Don't listen to don't listen to this crap that's like totally contrived and it's basically like, some kind of cookie cutter carbon copy of something that was fresh 30 years ago, but like hasn't changed since then, and now it's not even being dropped by guys who got any actual cred. I mean, that's kind of my issue. And I do believe too, like I said, metal is interesting because it was and is not just lyrically and in terms of motif, but musically, it really was kind of like a return to form. Like, not just in terms of like neoclassical trappings, but even like the guys who kind of shred and just, in a superficial way, like through form, kind of to the wind. Like, they were very much revolting against the kind of like languid, lackadaisical, like jam band sensibility. Because I mean, even metal bands that shred, like, I was saying here, Alexi Laiho just died, and that's one of the best shows I ever saw is when Children of Bodom played with Iced Earth. Although Schaffer wasn't on at the mic, it was Ripper Owens, interestingly. I mean, that's a whole other story. But in any event, like, listening to Laiho shred, I mean, it really was like controlled chaos, and that even like the technical sensibility was like, look, like we're basically revolting against everything that dropped on the radio between 1964 and like 1982, like that actually charted. So that's kind of the way I come at it. I mean, part of it's because I'm like old as fuck, but part of it is because there's definitely like a deeper sociological context. Like I don't want to get like too highfalutin when we're just talking about music we like, but this is like a real thing. It's not just stuff the academics like jerk themselves off about. If that makes any sense, that's kind of the way I always came at it. At least in adult
that's
life.
true. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm done. You go ahead.
Okay, good. And one of the things that there's a couple of different points there is that going on in the rap music is that a lot of white kids are getting into this. It does allow them to view masculinity through an alien lens. That the only way that they can be masculine is by being or enacting black, which is I think is like a very negative development that's happened. Is that, and it's affected a lot of our language. Even though sometimes I tweet in a way that is like derivative of black speaking rap, it is like I'm using it ironically, so maybe that's a
me
reason
too.
But it's the same way it is like we are seeing ourselves. It is like by listening to rap, and it is like a way of like we're too lame to make this music, and the only way we can make something cool and macho is to emulate black music and be like rap music. And this does create a negative effect is that like our own cultural norms aren't there. And even though like it's a little bit too much to say like metal, it's a little cheesy to say that metal is white form of music. It really is. I mean, and mostly later artists were trying to strip it of the blues influence, even starting from Judas Priest onward.
Definitely.
There's not much of a connection between black music and black metal. It was, and a lot of these bands were being influenced by classical music. Slayer, Metallica, all would talk about how they're influenced by classical music, and clearly a lot of the solos that were putting out, they were emulating what they heard in classical music, and even like some of the singing that the traditional heavy metal bands were, going for was influenced by opera and more traditional, like over the top singing. So it was something that like, it is like a more wider form of music, but people do find it distasteful, a D class. Not necessarily, I think even a lot of my audience is probably like, I don't want to listen to metal because it's weird or it's violent. I don't like it. I want to listen to something that's socially acceptable. I think a lot of people, they just choose their music based on what they just like hear on the radio, and they can convince themselves to listen to it. I think, and it's like a way, one of the things that's like similar with, having dissident politics and metal is like you have to actively seek this music and actively convince yourself at first to like it, because at first it's going to be unfamiliar and like extreme and discordant, and you're like, why is this guy growling at me? And then you have to really like focus in and get into it. And so it's a commitment to like the music that doesn't happen with, pop music that you're going to hear on the radio. Like there's no commitment to less enjoying it. You just sit there and like, the traditional verse chorus, song structure greets you. It's just somebody singing. There's not much of a commitment and focus there. That's one thing about rap music and, on pop music. And I do like your point about jam bands. I absolutely despise jam bands. I hate Grateful Dead. I hate Phish. I hate these bands. And also there's like a different social class for those bands. Like the biggest fans of jam bands are upper middle class white people. Like it's popular. That's who loves the music. It's like every DC, all these people in DC elite journalism that I meet, they're like, I love Grateful Dead. Some of the people are good. Like Ann Coulter, Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon are all into Grateful Dead. I know some other people, but it is like a prep school thing that you're into. This. While metal, it's like you're working class. That's D class. I don't like that. That's like even more D class than country music. Well, like jam bands, you're announcing yourself as like, I went to a prep school. I like have the correct beliefs, and like, but jam bands are terrible. It's like there's no direction in the music, while there's direction in heavy metal. Like there's a song structure and an urgency in metal. There is no urgency or whatsoever in like jam bands. It's like you're just sitting on the grass. Like the music just evokes you like just sitting on the grass and like staring out into space as you're like high, but there's like no deeper meaning towards it. And it's like some guys noodling some like on the solo for like 10 minutes and not in a cool way that develops anything. It's just totally structureless, totally formless. And it's just like that's what it evokes. It's like you're just sitting on the grass and you're thinking absolutely nothing except like, I'm happy That's it. That's jam bands.
No,
I
it's
absolutely
weird.
despise jam bands.
Yeah, it's weird as fuck. And like, I knew this broad in college, and she was kind of of that type that you described. But I mean, she and I were friends. Like, you know, we weren't romantically involved, but like I hung out with her a lot, and she was constantly trying to get me into Widespread Panic because they're kind of like the RC
Oh
Cola of
God,
like the
yeah.
big three of jam bands. Like there's Fish, there's Grateful Dead, they're like Coke and Pepsi, and then like Widespread Panic is like fucking RC Cola. And yeah, it's like I don't.
Dr. Pepper, maybe.
Yeah. But the way she and like she had this guy friend who was always kind of pining for her, but you know, she never given the time of day. But like they go to shows and stuff, and knew like I was into metal, and they knew that I knew something about music because I used to play music, and like they would be like, "Oh no, you don't understand." It's like, you know, you just really get into this like mental space. It's like, look, man, if I want to get deep into mental space, I'm gonna put on like Stained Class by Priest. I'm gonna put on In Search of Space by Hawkwind. I'm gonna put on you know, Emperor in the Night Side Eclipse. I'm not gonna listen to like fat hippies, yeah, just, you know, who are like nodding off from fucking heroin, like, you know, just kind of like languidly like strumming like for 4 hours and some like meaningless meandering like fucking not even solo, yeah, just like noodling like you put it. It's like, what? It's like, where's that gonna take me? Like it's you know, it's like I might go to sleep.
We're gonna have a drum
yeah.
solo for all of that, so yeah, that's really enjoyable.
Yeah,
music.
yeah.
And they really try to evangelize. Like Grateful Dead fans, I don't know anyone. If you like say you don't like the Grateful Dead, they're like, you don't. You have to listen to it. They will like they are stronger in their evangelism than any Bible pusher you've ever met. Than like the guy, than like Mormons. They're like. There's like a Mormon at your door. That's like Grateful Dead fans. They're like, you have to listen to this. Like Jerry Garcia is the greatest musician to ever live. Speaking of that, like in San Francisco, they're trying to replace, you know, they're replacing all these great historical figures in American history, such as Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. And one of the figures they want to replace him with is fucking Jerry Garcia. And I was like, this is the biggest outrage ever. I'd rather have Wakanda High School than Jerry Garcia High School. There should be no honors for Jerry Garcia.
Well, it's like so Bush League too, and it's like if you want to drop, if the left wants to drop some musician that like they think they can relate to, it's like at least like drop like Buddy Guy or like BB King or like, I mean Jimi Hendrix, who was like I realized Hendrix, despite the fact he did a bunch of Motown shit, I mean he played, you know, kind of like white rock and roll, but it's like, look, you know, there's plenty of, you know, if you're gonna play the token game with with monuments and naming schools, and you want a musician, it's like, look, man, it's like really like Jerry Garcia is like the best you can come up with. Like that's freaking pathetic. But no, yeah, they've got like all the Dead fans. They got some like a hard as fuck view of like the Dead, and if you don't accept it, you're like a bad person. And they develop this kind of like whole bullshit like like faux like very superficial like religiosity around it, because like, you know, the night Garcia died, and actually Garcia played his last show in Chicago, but like there was always these freaks who come up from Indiana and like down from Wisconsin when the Dead would play Chi-Town, and like, yeah, they always come at people like, no, you don't understand. It's like the vibe of the Dead show. It's like if the world could be like that, it'd be great. It's like, really, man, like people who smell bad, like smoking weed and nodding off from heroin, like that's kind of fucked up. I don't think that's cool. Like, you know, when I say that as a recovering
it's funny
I don't think
like
cool.
the white liberal elite loves this, but they're not not like that. They're like rim shot. You know, they're like at work every day, and they're like prim and proper. And they're like, you know, they're working like 80 hours a week, and then they go to their Grateful Dead concert, or which I mean, they have like Dead and Co. or they go to Fish, and that's what they're really into. And it is like, it is like a religious movement. And if you don't like the Dead, you're either a pagan or you're a heretic to them.
Yeah, exactly.
You must be converted. So, this highly respected does not highly respect the Grateful Dead. But moving on to some of your controversial metal opinions, is that a few weeks ago you were hating on King Diamond and Mercyful Fate. And now I have to really stand up for this, because King Diamond is in the background of Highly Respected's cover photo. And if those don't know what Mercyful Fate and King Diamond are, they're like traditional heavy metal band, somewhat similar to Judas Priest. They had a lot of influence on black metal and death metal, and they really were a band that were moving away from traditional verse chorus song structure, and they were heavily influenced by progressive rock. Really great solos and great guitar work in there. But for some reason, Thomas says they cannot hold a candle to the mighty Grim Reaper, which Grim Reaper was, one of these new wave of British heavy metal bands. There were dozens of them. They're like Iron Maiden, but they really stuck to the traditional verse chorus format, traditional rock song structure. And they are probably the ugliest rock band in human history.
They're not handsome.
So why do you hate King Diamond and Merciful Fate so much?
Well, I mean, Merciful Fate, Melissa is actually a pretty dope record, and like I actually bought that. I bought that CD like years ago, like because a friend of mine, he was like in the '90s, like when like Merciful Fate, like nobody gave a fuck about Merciful Fate. I think that's when King Diamond dropped. Like, he dropped this weird B-side album like previously unreleased stuff called like Return of the Vampire or something. And then his fans like were all like, I can't even remember, but it was a big deal. I remember like the record shop like by my house, like they dropped that, and that was kind of like a metal oriented place. And then he's like, King Diamond's like, okay, I'm getting the Merciful Fate back together, and it's gonna be dope. And then like all the Merciful Fate fans were like, oh hell yeah, and I'm like, Jesus man, I haven't thought about this shit since I was in like 7th grade. So like I went out and I bought Melissa, and yeah, it's actually an interesting record, and it's got the kind of, if you go into those really old British, like pre-heavy metal bands, like Coven from like 1970, like that's what it reminds me of. Like genuinely weird ass shit, you know, kind of like the dark side of the new age movement. And it's musically, it's like incredibly tight. I mean, I'm not gonna claim like Merciful Fate always had incredibly tight guitarists. They always had like an incredibly tight rhythm section. I just find King Diamond himself, he's like this failed glam rocker who became like the corniest motherfucker in heavy metal, and like that's why if I'm gonna go for if I'm gonna go for heavy metal that's like kind of like with that kind of like operatic style, and honestly, like as a lot of my readers know, I actually prefer Paul Di'Anno era, like Iron Maiden, because Paul Di'Anno to me is kind of like the punk rock Elvis. I think he's dope. Like not today.
That was the singer of the first 2 Iron Maiden albums for the.
But it's but that kind of like soaring operatic sound and like metal. If I'm gonna listen to that, you know, I mean, my favorite band of all time is Priest, and I mean, obviously it was the chops that Halford's got, but you know, there's like an edginess to Halford that kind of like always superseded that, and never just seemed like overtly campy. I mean, that's my issue with King Diamond, and like even the newer Merciful Fate stuff, it's not stuff I'm not gonna drop it on my fucking playlist when I'm just like, you know, writing at home or like hanging around with my Saracen bride, but if somebody puts it on, I'm not like fucking offended by it. I'm like, oh, turn it off, you fuck. I'm gonna like fucking murder you because I hate this shit. You know, like sometimes I come like hard as hell on stuff because I know it's gonna irritate people and like stir discussion. But no, it's more to do with like King Diamond himself and just like the corny ass shit that he does. And plus like his own, once he broke up Merciful Fate, like the King Diamond band, it's like we like which iteration are we talking about? Are we talking about where it's like Mickey D on guitar, or are we talking about when he had some like half-ass guy who like played once with Ozzy and like, you know, the band kind of sounded shitty. Like it's like there's like about like 8 different versions of King Diamond's band, some of which are like really, really tight, some of which are like garbage. I mean, so those are kind of my issues with him. With Grim Reaper,
the first 5 albums with King Diamond are really good. I really like both of them. Merciful Fate's first 2 albums and their EP are incredible. Don't Break the Oath and Melissa, and
no, I don't. I accept that, and yeah, I'm not gonna hate on that because yeah, I basically agree, even though it's generally not my speed. And yeah, to your point, the optics, if not the style, musical style of both Venom and King Diamond, I mean, that's where black metal comes from. And I've told that to young guys, and they're like, "No, it comes from Slayer." I'm like, "Dude, fucking Slayer was imitating Venom, man. Like, trust me on this."
Yeah, Slayer's like favorite band was Merciful Fate. Hell Awaits was essentially like a darker, heavier version of Melissa with big like time. Harsher vocals too, which they just got different vocals. But all those bands, and even like Megadeth and Metallica, love Merciful Fate, so they had a huge influence even on the thrash bands. So I'll respect that opinion that you just don't like King Diamond. I think he adds a flair to it. I think you even cited the world-renowned metal experts Beavis and Butthead to fortify your opinion on King Diamond. Like he called him out. And they're like clips that you can all find on YouTube. They basically say that King Diamond was the one guy to dress up in makeup, and the rest of the band said, we'll dress up in makeup. And then it's just King Diamond in makeup, and King Diamond's in like wears a type of corpse paint. And the rest of the band is just dressed normal, and they did it as like a prank, and they just kept rolling with it. Which also Beavis and Butthead hated Grim Reaper too. They really hated, they hated like every like
hell. Yeah, he's like Butthead's like, I think I saw these guys play the county fair last year. It's like here's my issue with Grim Reaper, okay? Like if you listen the first Grim Reaper record, which is See You in Hell, that record slams from like start to finish. And had it dropped a few years earlier, I think it would have really, really, really blown up. And yeah, I realize these guys, they're from some like they're from the same kind of godforsaken like English town like Ian Stewart was from, like some place where people like eat eels, everybody's ugly as sin, like the sun never comes out. Like this is not like glamorous heavy metal where you like, you know, do really high quality cocaine and have like the most beautiful groupies ever. It's not like the David Lee Roth life. It's like dirty fucking like heavy metal from, you know, the darkest, like grimiest corners of England in the 80s. But it's like one of the things that makes it dope. And musically it's very, very tight. And it's just I just developed, you think this is crazy as hell. Like I was never up on like the Bam Margera Jackass stuff. I always thought it was fucking retarded. But some of those like Jackass shows and movies had dope soundtracks. And on one of them they drop a bunch of Misfits tracks. But also there's this one, it's like this stupid prank where like Bam's dad's like mowing the lawn, but they created this like Viet Cong trap where he like falls in this giant pit basically. And like for the whole skit, like they're playing like "See You in Hell," and I'm like, you know, man, that actually was a dope fucking record because I had it when I was like 13 years old. I like downloaded it right after I saw that, and I'm like, you know, man, this record actually like holds up. So I started kind of like proselytizing it. Well, I had my little Honda, I had no 07 Honda Accord. Like people would get in my ride, and I'd pop in Grim Reaper. They'd be like, "This is pretty dope, man. Like, what is this?" And I'd be like, "It's Grim Reaper, man." And they like had never heard of Grim Reaper, so like that's kind of like where it came from. Like it was, I mean, it was a little bit ironic that I do that, but I honestly like Grim Reaper, man. I think they're like a dope fucking band.
Actually, I listened to See You in Hell. When you were talking about Grim Reaper, I actually did listen to See You in Hell. It's a pretty good album. Their follow up was Rock You to Hell, which literally
which
the
is pretty
song
weak.
is the exact same. They just ripped off
Yeah.
themselves and wrote Rock You to Hell. And Beavis and Butthead really didn't like that. They had
No, they
interesting opinions of Beavis, but they pretty much hated everything. Like good, they hated like the real metal bands. Like they hated Morbid Angel, Entombed, Napalm Death, Carcass,
Yeah.
whatever was like put forward. But they
Except
really liked
Pantera. Yeah.
they really
love
no, they
Pantera
really
and
like
Guar.
Pantera, which we'll actually we've got a couple of controversial music opinions to go on. So what are your thoughts about Pantera? I think when Pantera, for people who don't know, they were a huge post thrash. I mean, they invented this genre called groove metal, even though they ripped off a New Orleans band called Exhorder, which sort of wrote songs that were more in vein with like death metal, but they had like more groovier riffs. Pantera just did it in a more traditional rock format and had a more charismatic frontman in Phil Anselmo, and thus they became huge. And they were a big band in the 90s. And really, this was like, this is before nu metal, which we'll get into. And nu metal is not spelled N-E-W, it's spelled N-U, and it's no longer new. It's been around for at least 25 years. And so Pantera, when they got really big, they were like the last of the Mohicans in terms of like the big metal bands that in the 90s that didn't have any rap music. They would have still been considered, firmly within the genre. So what are your thoughts about Pantera? I really hated Pantera in high school, but I've grown to appreciate them.
Well, here's my thoughts. Here's what's fascinating, okay? When I was in like the 8th and 9th grade, I watched Headbangers Ball on MTV, and the guy who hosted it was a huge douche. Like now he does like NASCAR commentary. He's got Ricky Rackman. He's kind of the consummate like wannabe like cock rock kind of hanger on. But that's the only place you could see like new videos when they dropped. And so summer 1990, Cowboys from Hell drops, and the title track from that record was on Headbangers Ball constantly. I thought it was like the dopest thing I ever heard. Like Cowboys from Hell is still a freaking great album. And like every track on there, Cowboys from Hell, Domination, even Cemetery Gates, which is the freaking ballad on that album, it like rips your fucking face off. Like it's one of the heaviest albums ever, and it's a huge homage to Screaming for Vengeance. Now, my problem with Pantera, their follow-up to that was Vulgar Display of Power, and that's when suddenly Anselmo cuts his hair and he stops being, like this pretty boy frontman. Now he's like, this is like 92, and now he's like Joe, like skinhead. And like I saw Pantera in 93, and like that's who would show up at his shows. You'd get like, before Antifa was Antifa, they were ARA in Chi-Town. So you get like White Power Skins, and you get like ARA, and they'd show up at the Pantera show and like beat the fuck out of each other. And like that was, I know Phil Anselmo always claims like, oh, I'm not political, and I just wanted to shave my head. It's like bullshit, guy. Like that was, you're basically trying to like stir the pot. I mean, which is dope. I mean, that was the early 90s. That's what people were up on. But Pantera really, after Vulgar Display, had nowhere to go because they're like, oh, fuck this Pretty Boy shit. You know, we were like the hardest fucking band like that ever existed. So the only place to go beyond that was just something that was unpleasant to listen to, and that was Far Beyond Driven. I do not like Far Beyond Driven at all, and people slam me for that, but it's like it's just not enjoyable to hear, man. It's like I feel like upset after I listen to it. And I think the Great Southern Trendkill, I mean, that's when Phil apparently was most like in the depth of his like habit, you know, his heroin habit. I mean, I don't even know what to make of that album. It seems like a bunch of like outtakes or like jam sessions, but Reinventing the Steel, that's the only other Pantera album I went out and bought other than Cowboys. Reinventing the Steel actually is like a dope record. And I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it is like the most mature Pantera record, not just because like the Pantera dudes, you know, were like getting older, but it was, you know, it was like literally the final Pantera album. And I'll also say this too. I realize I'm kind of rambling, but Dimebag Darrell, he was a real axe man, and even if I mean, he really was. And like I saw him live half a dozen times, and other than Alexi Laiho, like nobody ever blew the roof off like a venue like Dimebag Darrell. Like the guy was like supernatural. I mean, and that's really what carried Pantera. It was Phil Anselmo's intensity and energy, and it was Dimebag Darrell's, you know, like virtuoso shit. So I mean, I think Pantera dropped like an incredible album in Cowboys and a very good one, and Reinventing the Steel. In between, I don't really like what they did, but I never liked that kind of like I never like crossover thrash. I was never big on hardcore, and like Vulgar Display. It was like some dude with a shaved head basically saying like "fuck you," I'm like even more hardcore than like Agnostic Front. And like the whole sensibility of that kind of put me off. Even when I was like 16, I was not really up on that shit. You know, like that's I mean that's probably like more than you were asking, but yeah, that's my view of Pantera.
No, that's a good. There's a lot to take off. Well, for me, I actually hate Cowboys from Hell. I actually like. I don't like Vulgar Display Power, but I like more for whatever reason. Like now that I'm getting older, Far Beyond Driven and Great Southern Trendkill more than I actually cannot listen. I hate Cowboys for Hell for whatever reason, but I understand like the Pantera. I ultimately think is like a negative influence over metal because it really did force like most of these bands to go with dumber riffs and force it on focusing on breakdowns and this like over the top tough guy machismo, which for Pantera it worked. But Pantera was one of the few bands that like kind of embraced that like we're, you know, like this is tough guy white guy machismo, and this goes into territories that you're not supposed to in the mainstream, like with right-wing politics and stuff. While a lot of the other bands like Biohazard and Machine Head were like wearing like end racism t-shirts and like, yeah, I'm a tough white ethnic from New York. And it's like, why are you wearing like an end racism t-shirt? And most of those bands were terrible. So Pantera is certainly not a fan. I really hated Pantera in high school. I thought they were to the metal scene as gay as well as AIDS were to the gay community. That's how I viewed Pantera. I don't know necessarily if I would still hold that view. But
well, no, a big part of the problem is Pantera fans, because Pantera fans were assholes, and they were like cliche, like fucking meatheads, and like that's. I mean, I agree with you. Pantera they were like legit cats. Like they were like nasty fucking Peckerwood rednecks, you know. Like Anselmo was from New Orleans, you know. The Abbott brothers were from Texas, and like I think Rex Brown's from like literally some border town, like the kind of place that like No Country for Old Men takes place at. Like those guys weren't faking, like that. They were like real dudes, and they could pull it off. But I mean, yeah, to your point, it's like, should you pull it off? You know, it's like you know, like, and yeah, it got to be just like too much in terms of image, and that's what really. But I mean, that's what I've made the point of all time and again to younger guys. Like, look, man, and like, even though it's kind of a degenerate, like quasi-pornographic movie, I recommend Kids, the Larry Clark movie, to people a lot because, like, people don't understand like how violent the early '90s were. It's like every male between like 15 and like 50 like had some kind of like enormous chip on his shoulder. Like I don't know if it was, you know, the blue balls, a Cold War, like war fever, not getting into catharsis it needed. I don't know if it was kind of the uncertainty of shit. I don't know if it was just like the tail end of, you know, the kind of cycle of violence that the Schrader brothers covered in Killing of America that started, you know, in 65, 66 and kind of endured to like 95, 96. But everything, any music that was at all like legit, like it was like Pantera, and it all had some like really shitty kind of like fucking it had like a fuck you sensibility, but not in like a dope way and kind of like a lame way. And it's like, yeah, nobody likes being around those fucking kinds of guys. Like, I mean, don't get me wrong. Like when I was when I was 17, 18 years old, I would always back up fucking right wing skinheads, man, when they got attacked by commies. But it's like I never really wanted to like hang out with those guys and like fucking be up on their shit. You know, it's like I don't like hang around ugly people who like love like bashing other people's heads in. You know, it's like makes me feel like I'm at the zoo in the fucking monkey house. But so yeah, I think a lot of Pantera's. I think a lot of their bad optics were, yeah, just like everybody's like, oh, yeah, in high school, like all the biggest jagoffs I knew were like these meathead Pantera guys who'd like, you know, beat the fuck out of people for no reason. Like, not because the music they listened to, but it's kind of shit they gravitated to. So yeah, I feel that.
Yeah, and we're in the 90s there was this, you know, there's a couple things I want to respond to that. In the 90s there was this among the popular metal bands that were still existing, there weren't that many. There was this white backlash mentality that a lot of those guys, you know, flirted with that. And at that time in the early 90s there was this a brief time of white backlash, which we've talked about in previous episodes. You know, Pat Buchanan was running a serious presidential campaign. David Duke was at his peak of his popularity. You know, you had the LA riots. You had a lot of people who were discussing these topics. Bell Curve came out. Jared Taylor's books were getting a serious consideration in the media. So there was also an immigration restrictionist movement. So there was this white backlash going on. And some of the metal bands did reflect that. Danzig had a whole album talked about White Devil Rise Up, which is a response to Farrakhan. Slayer's cover of Minor Threat's Guilty of Being White ended with Guilty of Being Right at the end. And Hypo Negative was also flirting with it. Peter Steele's previous band Carnivore had some very hilariously politically incorrect lyrics. And Pantera was really like the number one thing of it. And I knew people who were involved in the New Orleans metal scene from that time. And they said the whole scene was like racially aware just because of how like horrible New Orleans is, that they can't avoid the racial realities that go on there.
Oh, I'm sure.
They were like, yeah. And all those guys were like that. And Phil Anselmo really got into it is that he would, I think like in 93, 94, he would give these speeches about like white pride. Which they're like hilarious. He would just go up. He's like, I hate rap music. And it's like, I'm tired of like, black people can have pride. Hispanics can have pride. Why can't white people? And then he's also complaining about blacks wearing about like in black on black crime. What about black on white crime? And it's like, if you're white and proud, I want you guys to cheer yourself. So it's like you could have definitely not done that in these days. And he's clearly, I mean, he's had like drug problems and he's not necessarily lived his life very well. It still has those moments. Like he caught a lot of flack in 2016 for he's like drunk off his ass and he like said white power and gave a Roman salute on stage at somewhere. And he had to do all these apologies. But he clearly has like these views and he would just have this speech and like the whole crowd would go nuts when he would give the speech because a lot of those people, you know, nobody's allowed to say that stuff. And he's just like up there saying it. When MTV interviewed him about like their racial problems, he wore a shirt with the AWB, which is which is the South African Afrikaner resistance group. Very interesting optics, we'll say, on that group. And he was wearing their interlocking sevens. And he's like giving an interview about how they're not racist as he's wearing the shirt with their symbol on it. And then later afterwards, like, we found out the shirt is actually racist. Like the interviewer did. I think it was like Kurt Loder. So that was like an interesting time period with that. And there was also, even with the death metal bands and, you know, that weren't necessarily getting mainstream popularity, like Morbid Angel was clearly, their frontman was heavily into Nietzsche and was like getting some very hidden implicitly right-wing lyrics in some of their songs, like Where the Slime Live. World of Shit.
Yeah, their guitarist too he was a National Alliance guy. Like he was into like William Pierce's National Socialism brand.
From Morbid Angel?
Yeah. I can't remember
you're thinking of the frontman. You're thinking of David Vincent, who's the bassist and vocalist. He was he was the guy who was like into it. The guitarist is like this goofy autist, Greek autist, who I don't know if he like has ever thought about politics, but
No, I like Morbid Angel is a dope band. They are underrated. I agree with you on that. Like, the Covenant is a fucking dope album. I that's the only Morbid Angel album I really got into, but it was freaking dope, especially for the time, because yeah, there was not a lot like that. Definitely.
Oh, it's really good. And some of a lot of the European death metal bands were like politically correct because they took a lot of them came from the crust punk scene. Like Napalm Death, of course, was like had extremely leftist lyrics. So did Carcass when they got into politics. But then like the black metal scene took over, and all those guys had politically incorrect views. So actually, you know, to segue into like other topics is like, what is your views of black metal? Because that's like a, you know, something that's one of the music genres that like people kind of meme into as like a right wing music.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think I think the book is sensationalist in a tabloid way. Like, the book I'm talking about is Lords of Chaos by Didrik Soderlund, who's some kind of lefty, typical Scandinavian journalist, but it's also by Michael Moynihan. And Moynihan's actually a very interesting guy. And he's the dude behind Blood Axis. He's a buddy of Boyd Rice. He was up on some very strange things. I mean, not just musically. I mean, like, his politics are very strange. And he hung around Nicholas Schreck, who was like good buddies with Charles Manson, and married Zena LaVey. Like, and Zena LaVey was like buddies with Tom Metzger, which never made any sense. But I believe when people say like, I was watching the documentary Until the Light Takes Us, which is pretty good, and like, they were talking to Hellhammer, and he was they were asking him specifically about like Bart Faust and like the murder he committed. Apparently, this gay guy was like trying to cruise him, and Faust just like murdered the guy. But
yeah,
and then even Hellhammer's whole point, Emperor. Yeah. Hellhammer's whole point was he's like, the whole reason why like the black metal scene developed, it like developed around like a right wing sensibility. Like, that's why we were doing it. You know, and he's like, definitely like later, like there became, you know, a bunch of bands that were like apolitical, and, you know, bands that were actually like anti-racist, like corny as that seems for that scene. But you cannot, something Moynihan and Soderlund were right about, in Lords of Chaos, like whatever other kind of bullshit is up in that book, you really cannot extricate black metal from the right. You can't do it. It's basically, it's guys, the guys who are not overt National Socialists, like they're invoking those optics, and they're basically like revolting against, like, you know, blasé European humanism and explicitly right wing ways. And that's the way to understand black metal. Black metal is kind of like the indigenous, like pop cultural, like European revolt against secular humanism. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. You know, I mean, like, it just doesn't. And that's kind of Varg Vikernes. I've got mixed feelings about him because I think he says some very, very stupid things, but he also says some very insightful things.
He's got an incredible Twitter account. Not necessarily endorsing. It's just incredible content. So he's definitely an artist type. I will give him that.
Yeah, he is. He is. So I cut him slack in that regard too. But people are constantly asking him, like, why don't you drop Burzum albums? I guess he dropped a Burzum record in like 2016, but he basically is done with Burzum, and he's like, look, I think Burzum's run its course, number one. He's like, number two, he's like, I haven't properly played like black metal since before I went to prison, because he's like, that ran its course too. He's like, black metal was an expression of something perennial, but it could only really exist in the early 90s. And that's not just him like trying to, you know, be some artist like, oh, I'm way too fresh to be, you know, still doing the same shit I did when I was, you know, 30 years ago. Like, that's actually poignant, and he's actually right. Like black metal has a context of a very like peculiar point in time, and a handful of bands like transcended that. I think Emperor is fucking, they're an incredible band, one of my favorite bands. Like, Immortal is like a dope band. They're not on the level of Emperor, but they kind of transcended that and became kind of like unbelievably heavy like prog metal bands like in their own right. But, you know, we're talking about the true like black metal scene, you know, of like 1989 to like 1993, 94, like that. It's exactly what, for very different reasons, like Varg said it was, and what Moynihan and Soderlund said it was. Like, it was like nakedly political. Like, it was basically, it was a bunch of like creative young guys and musician types, you know, like literally from the woods in like Norway and Finland, and to a lesser degree like Sweden, you know, saying like, how can we make like a political statement in a way that has not yet been made yet, and that has a context. I mean, I don't even think they were consciously like trying to do that, but just organically, spontaneously. Like that's the form it took. So I think it's fascinating. I actually like a lot of that stuff. And even that of it that I don't like, I could never get into Dark Throne, even though people love Dark Throne. But like the early Dark Throne records,
I really like Dark Throne. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, even the stuff I can't like really get into, like I think it's fascinating to listen to, just because it's like, this is basically like a guy with like a low end like Sony tape recorder, like in a kid with his guitar, like in a cabin in the woods. Some like 18-year-old kid. Like that's really really incredible. And I know the Dark Throne guy with the Fenris, I think.
Fenris.
Fenris is always he's always kind of trying to distance himself from any politics. Like, he's never like repudiated like right wing politics or anything, but he just like doesn't want to talk about it. And he's like, I'm not politically minded, and that's dope. I mean, that's totally fine. But but again, like, he was obviously a guy who was like revolting against I mean, we think things are bad in America, like in terms of people not having outlets for ideas outside of the mainstream. I mean, if you want a place like Norway or like really anywhere in the EU, I mean, you're not there. There literally is like one single opinion. I mean, and that's what these kids were up on. They're like, no, fuck that. Like, that's not who we are. It's not. We don't want any part of that. Like, and that's that doesn't actually facilitate any kind of human creativity. So I mean, the black metal scene ended horribly, and with people senselessly being butchered and things, and ancient churches being burned down, and all kinds of other like nonsense. Some of it was just frankly silly as fuck too. Like, I'm not gonna like try and make it into this like noble thing when there was a lot of ignoble and stupid shit around it. But at its core, it was like very, very heavy and like very profound. I mean, that's my view of it in a nutshell.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot what you said. And the last point I would say about black metal is that I think actually I kind of disagree with that point, that it's like it can only be very unique to a period of time. I actually think it's one of the few metal genres that is not stuck in a time period. Like, you look at thrash metal, all the best albums came out in the late 80s, early 90s. Same, well, really mostly late 80s. Death metal, all the best albums came out in the early 90s. There's not really any more creative input that you can really get out of it anymore. But with black metal, there's still like, it's not stuck in a period of time, even though this is when it reached.
Oh no, I agree.
Creative fruition. I think it's still like one of the few genres where it's not trying to consume or capture a feeling that was present in the 90s. I think it's one of the few bands that are genres that's developed in time, and it sounds still new and fresh, and it's not really captured in one period of time. But that's the only point I would like to say about black metal. I think we'll have like a whole other episode. A whole episode can be dedicated to black metal. But going through other random 90s genres that were adjacent to metal, I want to get your thoughts on grunge, because that was the huge thing in the 90s, and that's what people claim killed heavy metal. So what are your views on grunge?
I mean, I think I've got a minority view on this, and maybe it's because I was from like the big city. Like, Kurt Cobain didn't like single-handedly kill like hair metal and heavy metal when he dropped Nevermind. Like, Guns N' Roses is what killed that, because they were way too edgy and they were up on something totally different. And I mean, I think GNR is like a solid band in their own right, but they represented kind of like this transition from all that like broke ass shit of the Sunset Strip, as well as like people's kind of changing tastes with, they're no longer being iconics for what they had been listening to. Like, grunge is the reason why people went crazy for grunge is this, okay? Like, I think I was never into Nirvana. I think Kurt Cobain was a fucking pathetic character. I do kind of like Soundgarden, but what it was is that these are the kinds of bands where if you were like cruising up and down Highway 101 and you went into like some like rock club, like you'd hear bands like Soundgarden, you'd hear bands like Screaming Trees, okay, like, or you'd hear bands like Nirvana. And sometimes even in Chicago, you'd get up on bands like that, when they were kind of like traversing the country. But people who were kind of like in what lefties call flyover country, they'd like never ever heard anything like that, because like all they heard is like what got dropped on MTV. It's like suddenly they're like, oh wow, this is like blowing my fucking mind. I can't believe there's such diverse music out there, and this is this great new thing. It's like, it's really not new, man. It's like there was guys that sound like, crazy as it sounds, like Merle Allen, Gigi Allen's brother, like, his name was Gigi Allen. Merle Allen actually is a pretty talented musician. He played with this band that used to open for Debbie Harry called Thrills, and they sounded a lot like Screaming Trees and a lot like those, like, early, like, fucking grunge bands. I mean, and this was, like, in the late 70s, okay? It's like I think it was basically, too, that what was being dropped on MTV by, like, 89, 90, it was, like, so formulaic. There's, like, literally half a dozen, like, hair metal bands that you could not tell them apart. And, like, whatever was charting, it, like, literally sounded identical to everything else. You know, it's like the recording industry became, like, so kind of ossified and so huge. You know, they simply were just reinventing the wheel, like, over and over and over and over again. I mean, I think it was like I think it was those things. I think it was geography and isolation. There not being a consumer internet. You know, the record industry, like, basically just kind of dropping stuff on people that literally had not changed in a decade. Like, it was kind of a perfect storm of stuff. So, like, Nevermind, which, even though I don't like Nirvana, I mean, it's not like a bad rock album, but it's not Exile on Main Street. You know, it's not Iron Maiden Over the Beast. It's not Judas Priest Screaming for Vengeance. It's like a pretty good, like, rock album. It's not just like incredible fucking multi-platinum record. I mean, that's my view of it. And I mean, I was in high school when all that happened, so I mean, I remember it. I mean, yeah, that's
No.
at least that's the way it struck me as in Chicago, like how it developed.
That's it. I actually really don't like grunge, but that's usually my opinion. I liked grunge as a kid. I was like, oh wow, this is like cool music. But that was like
Yeah.
before I had been introduced to metal. But I have a lot of thoughts on that. But I want to continue to move on to get your thoughts on other genres. And so the last one I want to ask about is, what are your thoughts on nu metal? Because you would have been probably out of high school, probably college age when that was big in the late 90s.
Yeah.
What did you think of that development and why that became big?
Well, it was. I'm not like a Simpsons fan at all, but like when Conan O'Brien was like writing some for The Simpsons, there was actually some pretty funny shit on it. And there was this one episode where I can't remember exactly what the context was, but it's basically there's this cartoon character and he's like promoting like Duff beer, he's promoting like cigarettes, he's promoting cola, he's got like his own line of clothes, and he's like this wigger like animal. It's not clear if he's a dog or like a monkey, but he's basically like every consumer tendency like wrapped into one mascot. And he's like his name's like Poochie or something. And among other things, he's like this totally obnoxious wigger, but he also like, carries around like a guitar and shit. Like I look at like nu metal as like basically being that. It's like, okay, so when grunge did hit, you know, you got these like Gene Simmons type idiots that, you know, like fucking yeah, like Warner Brothers or whatever, like Geffen Records, like, oh fuck, what do we do? You know, the kids, they like this ghetto rap shit. Find some pretty boy guy and, you know, put some makeup on him, but like have him like, you know, have him like, you know, have him like drop some stuff on turntables occasionally, you know, and do a lot of breakdowns and like have him like rap over his, you know, fucking very, very basic, you know, like guitar leads. Like I think it's really that simple because it's like, and that's also why I like faded immediately. Like I like randomly some movie when I was really sick the other day, I was watching some like stupid it was some stupid like Will Smith Enemy of the State from the 90s. Like this kind of dumb like Will Smith movie. Somehow Gene Hackman's in it, but at this one part it's like Will Smith like he's like shopping for his wife and he like stumbles into a lingerie store. So there's like hot girls in there in lingerie. I mean, which doesn't make any sense either, but like Cold Chamber is like playing in the background in the mall. And it's like, geez, I haven't thought about that in like, you know, 20 years. But it's like, there's no way a band like Cold Chamber just like comes about. It's like, that's some like half-ass like record company execs saying, you know, creating like Poochie the dog or whatever to like say like, you know, how do we recover on these losses we're eating? I mean, I think it's really that simple. What does piss me off is I do like the Deftones, and the Deftones are not a nu metal band. That's very much like West Coast, like kind of rock and roll with like some proggy and like grunge influences, like Faith No More was. But yeah, when I think of nu metal, like I think of like I think of like Limp Bizkit as like the consummate like nu metal band, and that's also why like it's bizarre like Fred Durst like just ceased to exist. It's like nu metal never happened, and that owes the fact that it was that contrived. I mean, that's maybe it's because yeah, I was not a kid when that shit dropped. I was like in my 20s, but I thought it was bizarre then. I think it's bizarre now. Like in hindsight, yeah, I think it's kind of like this. I think it's kind of like this Frankenstein chimera of like some fat fuck in a record company office who like looks like Gene Simmons, like deciding that's like the way to go because that's what the kids want to hear.
No, I agree with that, and it's one of the few genres ever, rock genres, that there is no retro nostalgia for. There is not
No.
like a neo new metal trend. Like everyone hates new metal, and it's like a bad memory. There's like no nostalgia for it at all, and you'll see that with
No.
every genre. There's nostalgia for grunge, for hair metal. There's zero nostalgia for new metal, and a lot of it's aged horribly. Stuff like Korn. I guess you would say like some of the bands that maybe escaped new metal unscathed, I guess, who are still popular, like Slipknot. I hate Slipknot, and
Yeah,
and Deftones would be another that incorporated rap music. But in some ways, it was like the core. It was also like an evil invention, because it's like we're gonna take what a music that is otherwise white, and we're gonna add, you know, black and diverse influences to it. And also, a lot of these bands, they were like, we need to get you know, these bands to have diversity, and most of these bands all had like Hispanics or blacks. There was never just like, it was like 5 or 6 white guys together. It was always like you know, they like had a racial quota that they had to meet for this band. And it was very much, and the styles that they wore, of course, were emulating you know, Wigger styles. And so it was a very, you know, is an attempt by the record companies to make a more multicultural, more multiracial heavy metal. Unfortunately, it has not survived into our day. But going on to another big late 90s music phenomena that is now back in the news. Marilyn Manson is getting in the news, and I announced on Twitter that I didn't really like his music. It's not really metal. It's much more of a distorted, harder version of David Bowie in a lot of ways. There's not even really like a use of, like, the guitars like aren't, like the riffs aren't even really important to the music. But he is getting me too'd right now by his insane exes, and it's a huge shocker that Marilyn Manson would be an abusive maniac. I cannot believe that, and that the women that he dates would also be insane and would have deranged grudges against him. So I can't really imagine that. But what are your thoughts on Marilyn Manson and his music? But it's really more important is like him as a phenomenon, because I really see him as the last otherwise whitish music that you know, as the last gasp of the PMRC mindset that we have to eliminate rock music really happened with Marilyn Manson.
Well, it was weird because his whole ascendancy, like, basically he was the protege of Trent Reznor, and if you listen to Portrait of an American Family, which dropped in '95, that sounds like a Nine Inch Nails record, and it's a pretty good album. Like, I'm not a huge Reznor fan, but his production chops really are like second to none. So if you listen to the first Manson record, it really is kind of like a more melodic, like industrial record. Like where he went beyond that, you're absolutely right. It's like he basically, it was like this kind of like, it was kind of like this tweaked, like, you know, recycled glam stuff, but, you know, just with like heavier riffs and some like vestigial like industrial influences. Like Manson himself, it was weird how he kind of became, there's something that seemed hokey about it. Like, you know, as I'm sure you remember, even though I know you were like just a kid then, but like when Columbine happened, like these people, like Marilyn Manson kind of became the face of, you know, like a degenerate pop culture, and these kids were all into Marilyn Manson. Like, no wonder they, you know, developed these fucked up ideas and everything like that. And there's something about that seemed like out of time, even in 1999. It's like, it seemed like something you'd hear in 1985. You know, it seemed like a redux of, you know, those kids, you know, shooting themselves in the face, and then the local pastor saying, like, you know, Rob Halford did this, you know, he's making people worship the devil. And then, like, before you know it, like, you know, Halford's being hailed into court, and like Geraldo's like doing his like Satanism special. Like, but I also think Manson kind of parlayed that. Like, Manson answered questions like he answered these questions very strangely, and then he goes out like after Columbine, and then he does like Michael Moore's documentary, but it wasn't even like elaborate apologia, nor was it him, you know, being, you know, a typical anti-gun kind of like woke idiot. You know, he kind of tried to like play the role of like this like dark evil figure or something. When it was just lame, because Marilyn Manson's like this fucking just kind of like suburban pervert, but like who lived with his mom and dad who was like 25. But I mean, all that aside, like any credit issues aside, I think to your point, I think that's one of the reasons people liked Marilyn Manson, because both squares who were like kind of frightened of everything all the time, and kids, like nobody like makes sense of the culture anymore. And it's like, oh, here's like an evil rock guy who like tears the Bibles and says he's like the Antichrist. You know, I get that. I can make sense of that. So it's like, I think he both became sort of he became kind of like iconic for people, and like as a man, people love to hate, as well as like this dude who's like, yeah, he's like, oh, he's the evil David Bowie, you know, like, okay, yeah, that makes sense to me now. It like makes sense in a way that like shit like Fear Factory didn't make sense, you know, or like Skinny Puppy didn't make sense, or KMFDM, you know. So it's like people kind of wanted to get into heavy music, but like weren't real thoughtful. Like, I mean, that I know it sounds like some kind of like too cool for school fucking opinion, and maybe it is, but I believe I'm onto something because I thought about this a lot. Like I've actually written pretty extensively in the Columbine thing and in the kind of media panopticon, like Marilyn Manson, like he became a prime symbol. Like weird as that seems, like he really did. I mean, that's kind of my view of him in a nutshell. Why he's being trotted out by like the woke to be Me Too'd. You know, it's like I said in my timeline. It's like, what are you going to trot out Joe DiMaggio because he said shit about the Negro League? I mean, like, who the fuck even who the fuck under 35 even knows who Marilyn Manson is? You know, I mean, it's like it's weird, man. It's like why? It's like, okay, so you're gonna drag out like 55-year-old like has been rock stars. You're like, yeah, you know, 30 years ago this guy was a fucking jig off. You know, it's like, okay,
Yeah,
maybe he
I
was,
know,
man.
and it's like it is bizarre how he's getting trotted out, and it's like it's just personal relationships. It's like I'm surprised all these celebrities have these like fucked up relationships, so I'm not surprised that Marilyn Manson and the insane women he dates would have these kind of relationships. But it's like bizarre. I mean, I don't want to get too much into Me Too. There's a couple of topics that I want to save up, you know, with Me Too and Columbine. But the one point I wanted to say is that the funniest thing about Marilyn Manson becoming the face of like the problems with Columbine is that the Columbine shooters didn't even like Marilyn Manson. They were KMFDM fans. That was like their favorite band. They didn't like Manson. But KMFDM is like this weird German band, industrial rock band. I guess they didn't make, and they weren't as popular. While Marilyn Manson was getting played on MTV's Total Request Live, which Zoomers definitely don't know what the hell that is, but some of the millennials may, and even some of the younger millennials might not know. But he was played on Total Request Live. KMFDM, Ministry, and those bands weren't. And that does signal about his popularity. He was getting interviewed by Bill O'Reilly and all these people who wanted to have, you know, a cultural panic over him being sold. And he did provide that, but he's very different from metal in that he was androgynous. There was like a effeminate character to him. There's all these urban legends that he had removed his ribs so he could suck his dick. Which everyone was pointing out when I said Marilyn Manson has always sucked, and they're like, "That's right, because he removed his ribs." And like that was like a cool lunchroom rumor. I don't know who the hell spread that, but that was like a very popular thing about him. And it was like a way of saying that this guy is not a real man. He's like something in between. Which now, like in our transgender loving age, maybe he would not be, he would be seen as like a hero. He couldn't be a villain anymore because like his values are now like mainstream values you see on CNN. Like CNN would trot him out to like say he's a hero, which then at that time, due to the different culture, he was a villain. So there's a lot to, you know, play on that, but I want to get to one final metal topic before asking the listener questions for Thomas. And this one is about, you mentioned Iced Earth earlier, but John Schaffer is also in the news. Iced Earth, of course, was a popular power metal band. I like some of their stuff. I think they're a little goofy, but it's a band that, like, if somebody turns it on, it's like, oh, this is okay. Not a favorite, but I do respect John Schaffer for what he did. Is he's the guitarist and main guy behind Iced Earth. He was arrested for his involvement in the Capitol protests, and there's several videos of him there. He's got Oathkeeper gear on. He's carrying bear spray with him, and he's very eager to go through. I'm not sure what crimes he committed besides illegally entering, but all the metal outlets are calling him a terrorist, and his bandmates are throwing him under the bus. So what do you make of this, of how, like, you know, metal's supposed to be, you know, this rebellious genre that's like, you know, doesn't take, you know, it's not going to give a shit about somebody getting arrested for this. I mean, and compared to rappers, you know, are getting arrested for like serious, like, felonies of them, like rape, murder, you know, sexual abuse, and, you know, beating up some guy to death, nearly to death. You know, compared to this of like him just wandering around the Capitol, doesn't seem like as serious a crime compared with rap. But, you know, the whole metal world is calling him a terrorist.
Well, what I thought was crazy about it, like Iced Earth's an interesting band, and I was never a huge fan of theirs, but I saw them in 2004 at the Metro because they played with Children of Bodom, and I wanted to see COB, so I saw Iced Earth. But that was between it's after Matt Barlow left, and they had Ripper Owens. He's the guy who, the one and only Priest album without Halford is Jugulator, and Ripper Owens is on the mic on Jugulator. So it was Ripper Owens dropping all these Iced Earth tracks. They did a concept album then that was like about like American heritage. And interestingly, like the stage set up, they had like a Betsy Ross, and they had like a Confederate battle flag. And I mean, in Chicago, people, like white people, think that kind of stuff's dope, or at least they did like 20 years ago. So I mean, I thought that was kind of cool. It was a good show. Ripper Owens is actually like, he's like a dope fucking front man. But what shocked me was I got on Blabbermouth because I saw Iced Earth in the news. And I'm like, oh shit. Like my younger brother, he's dead, but he was a musician, and he actually he knew the guys in Iced Earth like casually. So when I see Iced Earth, it's like, oh wow, what's going on with Iced Earth? And yeah, I find out Schaffer got arrested. Then I go on Blabbermouth, and it's like all these guys like calling for his head. It's like, dude, are you guys trolling? Like, you're metal fans, and you like want the police to, like, arrest like, other members of this community? It's like, what the fuck's the matter with you? And like, even if you don't like Schaffer for some reason, like, who the fuck like cheers on people getting arrested? Like, that's like nobody.
Yeah, and ratting him out to the FBI too. It's like the way it's like, yeah, FBI, this person's dangerous, and it's like, meanwhile, I'm going to throw on a Dissection album, and Dissection's guy was an accomplice to a murder of a taxi driver like 20 years ago. And it's like, there's so many of these guys have been involved in crimes, and it's like, whatever. It's not necessarily you have to condone his actions, but the moral hysteria around Schaffer is pretty outrageous. Well, and one of the weird, interesting things about Iced Earth is they've always been like known as like a conservative band, right? In some way that's like very goofy. It's like, yeah, they have all these patriotic lyrics. And the funny thing about Matt Barlow is like looking up about Iced Earth is that he became a cop.
Yeah, exactly.
And he's like in a cop band. Their name's like the state police force, and they're like, he's like in a cop rock band. It's like,
no, and it's weird, cop rock band. It's fucking horrible. But I actually, I think no, that's why Ripper Owens was filling in for Iced Earth, because fucking Barlow was like doing his policeman thing, like he like left the band, like, go be a cop. So yeah, they're like, it's like, look, even if you are like a square fuck who like loves the cops, it's like, you should like Iced Earth, like they're your kind of people. But I mean, look, I guess it's a generational thing. It's me getting old. I guess maybe it's because I'm like a disreputable person. Even the guys I know who are kind of nerdy, who are kind of squares, they do not like the police, and they would certainly not like cheer on, unless the person in question was like a child molester or something. They would never cheer on like somebody being arrested. Like, certainly not a guy like Schaffer, who was, basically just raising hell because he was very legitimately like upset about the political situation. It's like, what the hell's the matter with you people? It's like, are you guys, am I talking like a bunch of like AARP members? Like, are you guys kidding? Like, I couldn't really get a grip on it. But that's one of the frightening things about this country. Like, it's that people like that AOC woman, like I'm always saying, if I think she's like literally developmentally disabled. Like, were she not like a protected minority, people be saying like, is this woman mentally retarded? Like, you got people like that, like, serving in relatively high office. You got, kids don't rebel anymore. Now they like love the police and, are desperate to see people arrested who run afoul of these kinds of public strictures. Like, yeah, it's insane, man. I mean, that's my view of it at a glance. I didn't deep dive into it, but yeah, I was shocked and kind of horrified, frankly.
Yeah, and the metal journalism scene is, a lot of these guys are now Antifa. I mean, the most influential metal journalist, Kim Kelly, is a like Antifa organizer. And so there's all these people. It's become much the hipsters who've got into metal like 10 or so years ago.
Right.
They've been definitely policing the scene much more, especially in the black metal circles. So of course, it's no surprise that they would label old John Schaffer as a terrorist. So there's so much more to talk about metal, and we're going to definitely have more episodes about this. But I want to move on to the audience questions that we've gotten from Thomas. And some of these people didn't want to name themselves this time, but because their questions, are so hot that they have to ask them. But we've got two for Thomas. Yeah. The first one asks, Thomas, why do you think Zoomers want to dress up like Sailor Moon and fuck the Snorlax Pokemon?
Like, why do I think that? Because that's what they want to do. Because, like, every Zoomer I run across online, he's some, like, androgynous weirdo who apparently was sired by somebody, because otherwise they wouldn't exist, but none of them seem to have a father, like, that's known. every single one of them has a female avatar, and like they all, despite being like 20 something, like love Pokemon. Like that's why. And the only girls I've heard him talk about are like AOC or like some gross porn star who like reminds them of their mom. Like that's why. It's because that's what they are. It's like saying like, Tom, why do you think like black people like like are good at sports and like have dark skin? It's like I don't know, man, because that's what they're like. Like Tom, why do you think water's wet? I don't know, fucker. Like maybe because it is.
Well, maybe we could save the Zoomers from the Snorlax Pokemon, but we'll have to look into this. The second question may be from a Zoomer, and he's not trying to get a date from a Snorlax. He wants to know how he can get a top Sadie like you.
I mean, I don't know, man. Like, even though I do not have like a whole lot going for me, like I've always been fairly lucky in life, whether it was avoiding catastrophic injury or when I was having trouble with the law and like I was having problems with addiction, like I could have gone to prison for like many years, but like basically like nothing bad happened other than like me ending on probation, and I just kind of like accidentally met this like really beautiful like younger broad who like for reasons that don't entirely make sense like really likes me. Just so I it's kind of like dumb luck and like a weird convergence of circumstance, and I don't know, man. It's like don't overthink this stuff. Don't join some dating site. I'm like a weird old guy, and like I just kind of be yourself and be romantic and like love the pussy, and like girls will like respond. I mean, that's my best advice I can give.
All right. Well, we're ending on a high note, I would say with that. And that's all the time we have for Highly Respected today. Thomas, tell the good people how to follow your work.
You can follow my work at real _ Thomas777.substack.com. That's my Substack. There will be more content being dropped on there in coming weeks. I've been working on some print media projects that have kind of been taking up my time, like post holiday. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's at real _ Thomas777. And I am pretty active on Twitter about every day. And but yeah, if you're new to like my work product, there's a ton of stuff on Substack to keep you busy for a minute, and there will be more like in coming weeks. So yeah, that's I'm hoping by March, April, I have some print content that is you're going to be able to score through me directly or through Amazon. But for now, like that's where you can access me and the stuff that I drop.
Awesome. And I, of course, encourage all of my listeners to follow his work, and particularly his Twitter account. I would say that Thomas has one of the most entertaining accounts, if not the most entertaining account on Twitter. So I encourage everyone to follow his work and to support him any way you can. And anyway, thanks for coming on, Thomas. We will have you on very soon. I think we've got a ton of topics to talk about. Not just metal, Scott, but on politics and history. So thanks again for coming on.
No, thank you, my guy. I appreciate you. I got love for you all day, man.
All right, thank you. We all have love for Thomas. And on that note, until next time, stay respected.